With the economic pressure on the news business, do you, and I think this means you institutionally as news organizations, have the capacity to investigate tough stories like electronic voting machine fraud?
I'm sorry, do we have...
Do you have the economic resources to investigate tough stories? And the person who asked the question gave the example of electronic voting machine fraud, but I think it goes beyond that.
You know, if you have, do you have the resources? You have the resources if you decide to dedicate those resources. I could think of a series we did out of our Detroit office. Melvin Claxton was the lead reporter, but they spent 7 months looking at the Detroit Fire Department, and it was just a great series. There were, you know, there was no pressure in the hydrants. There was a lack of equipment. There were deaths that resulted because they didn't have, you know, a meter or a hydrant was out, so they didn't have enough hose to get from the next. I mean, that took a long time. They invested a lot of money, a lot of man hours to get there. So yeah, I mean, the willingness is there. You have to get the right story, and you have to get the editors excited about it. But I still think the resources are there if we want to commit them.
Anybody else have thoughts on that?
I think, frankly, it's a tougher sell than it used to be. There is a lot more interest now in the quick turnaround story. What can you do for me today? Do you really need a week to do this, or can you do it in 2.5 days? Can you do part of it and throw it up on the web and finish the rest of it later? There is a lot more pressure along those lines. Some of that's competitive, some of it's economic. You really have to be able to show how this project is going to matter in order to get the clearance to spend. I mean, I would say anything outside of 2 weeks is a pretty major commitment these days at a lot of newspapers. If you're going to work on the same story for 2 weeks, the days of spending 6 months to 9 months working on a story are pretty rare, and there's much more interest in turning a story quickly that's going to have quicker impact than there is on doing the kind of research that may or may not produce the story that you hope it does.
2 weeks, wow, what a luxury.
Right. Yeah, AP is a whole different world.
Right, but you know, I mean, it was like that. I mean, in newspapers, we did have to have more time than I think I would get today if I was at a newspaper. AP is at an interesting place right now because our biggest paying customer, who's not a member, is Yahoo. And I would expect that Google's right behind now that we finally have an agreement with Google. And so there's, you know, they still want us to be covering the legislature, they still want us to be filing a lot of stories, and they still want hard-hitting news and things like that. But I'm telling you, we're going to start gradually moving more and more to feeding that national beast, because that's what they want. They want the stories up on Yahoo, and they want the stories up on Google, because that's where the revenue stream is. And, you know, so it's like, come up with something that is of impact nationally, you know, which we've always done. I mean, I have a story in the National Wire today about the governor's race, and, you know, which is because this is one of the ones that are more interest nationally. But they really want to find stories that we can get up that are going to have national impact, whether they're more investigative stories or whether they've got a really good multimedia aspect to them. You have video of something that's really great, which I think is the other thing. You know, we're telling more stories that
in different ways.
Yeah, do you have really good video? Well, then that's going to be a top story because you've got good video, you know, or a good soundbite or something. So all this multimedia things are really making a difference in the way that we approach things. But like Ron says, it's not just about, there's a constant need to have something else out on the website for all of us. And because of that, you know, it's like, well, what can you give me now? So,
Kathy, this question ties in to some extent with that comment. The person's stating millions of dollars for a budget, yet one layer of government remains uncovered in elections, the county commissioners, virtually ignored. Why not cover who they are, what their spending record is, what they do for the county? How do we handle that void?
well, I think that's what local newspapers should be doing. I mean, those are the people that count, and newspapers are trying to focus more and more on local news because you can get your national news off of Yahoo or Google or an internet site here or there, or the television or whatever. I mean, local news is what papers are trying to do more of. And I think you're right. I think local candidates need every bit as much scrutiny as the people that are going to be running the state. You know, these are people that are, especially in big communities like Wayne County commissioners are doing everything from setting up, you know, youth facilities to mental health boards and things like this. I mean, they handle every bit as many things as the state government does. So, you know, there's no way that AP is ever going to get down to that level of coverage. That's just too local. And, you know, I always say the story has to pass the Alpena test. You know, if it's not going to be of interest to somebody in Alpena, then it's not got enough statewide appeal. So we don't cover really anything that's local. In fact, we've been looking at, you know, there's a great many state legislative races right now where people have been running a lot of ads, and some ads have been pulled, and there's been some charges of racism. And we've thought about trying to wade into that, but how do you write about a race in Kalamazoo over here and a race in some other community? That, again, will somebody read that story as a statewide story if they don't have any candidates involved? So it's a little hard for AP to do, but I absolutely agree that local media, that should be their forte, because you want to know who those people are that are running for those seats.
The major metropolitan dailies, Charlie and Ron, how do you weigh in with at least the suburbs on that same question?
Well, on an editorial page, when I took over the editorial page 8 years ago or so, one of the things we did do is decide to dedicate the resources to doing endorsements at the county level, which we had not done before. And so we are spending more time with county commissioners, district court judges, every city that has a full-time mayor, and that's the only part that I'm responsible for, but we do those. And Joe Stroud, my late great predecessor as editorial page editor of the Free Press, told me on his way out the door into retirement that he said, always remember that a Free Press endorsement is worth 10% of the vote, but that could be either way. And I think we actually have found that our endorsements in such things as the governor's race and the U.S. Senate race may not make as much of a difference to the outcome, and maybe don't make any difference at all because TV so dictates what people think about the candidates and the image they have. But our endorsements at the local level, because we meet candidates that most people don't have a chance to meet, and we spend time with them because that's part of our job. We do that sort of, you know, the kind of work that average regular voters simply don't have the opportunity to do. And I do think that we have an impact at that level, and that's why we've gone down to the county commissioner level and making endorsements now.
We have Charlie, you want to?
It's difficult. We don't have really the space to devote to all of these races. It's not just that. I noticed you guys today had, I think there were 3 legislative races, one from Macomb, one from Oakland, one from Wayne. And we do the same thing. There just isn't the resources, we don't have the space to devote to it. Quite frankly, a lot of these, once you get past the primary, just because one district, this is a Republican's not going to get elected to the state house out of Detroit. And much of Oakland County, you get into the higher end economic scale, they're not going to send Democrats in. So the races, like, you know, on election day in November, there's 148 races in the legislature up. There may be 15, and that's a stretch. There may be 15 that are really competitive, and I would argue that the number is less than that. But it is a problem. We don't have the space, and as Kathy said, that ought to be a void picked up by the local newspaper. But it is a problem.
Ron, you're paid to be opinionated.
Mm-hmm.
So, political question, how would Michigan be different today if Blanchard had defeated John Engler, or would the situation be generally the same?
I think the economic situation that we're in would have happened no matter who was in the governor's office. Those are forces that are largely beyond the control of the governor's office. Had Blanchard prevailed in 1990, boy, interesting question. There would have been a number of initiatives that Engler undertook would probably never have happened. I think the very divisive issue of what in Detroit is regarded as the state takeover of the Detroit schools would not have happened because that was not a political base that Blanchard was going to mess around with. That wouldn't have happened. I think the general divisiveness that seems to have taken over politics in this state would not have happened quite to the extent that it has had Blanchard remained governor. He was an easier guy to get along with than Engler in that sense, and I don't think he would have been as divisive politically. Maybe the lines would not be quite so firmly drawn. And the other big difference, of course, is that The state Supreme Court might look considerably different if a Democrat had been making the appointments that Republican Engler made. And that court has had a big influence in shaping public policy in Michigan.
Kathy or Charlie?
Well, I think, quite frankly, I think John Engler was determined to be governor. So I think if he had lost, and had lost narrowly, I think he would have had a very good chance of winning 4 years later. He had the organization, he had, he'd gone around, he'd met everybody. He was smarter than almost any other politician I've ever met, especially when it came to politics. And so I think we would have ended up with Governor Engler eventually anyway. I think a lot of things that John Engler did in his first term would have just gotten delayed. I mean, we would have not had maybe some of the changes in welfare and things that we had right away under Engler, but I think we would have had them eventually anyway. As you saw, John Engler was very instrumental in changing national welfare policy in '95 and '96. So that was something that I'm sure we would have had anyway. As far as divisiveness, I don't, it's kind of, I do think that John Engler was very determined, and he did twist an awful lot of arms in his career. But I think that things have gotten divisive because they've gotten divisive nationally. I just think that we are a very evenly divided country, and so we fight about things a whole lot more because we're so close to the margin of winning if we can just move a few people one way or the other. And so I just think the whole tone nationally has gotten very, very harsh, and I think that you're seeing that in state politics as well.
Yeah, and I agree with both of those. I mean, if John Engler had not won, his first year he came and did something that people thought that were predicting riots in the street, and that was there were 83,000 people on something called general assistance, and these were mostly able-bodied men who were collecting welfare, and Engler did away with that. Which was just amazing. At the time, that was the most shocking political move. I can't believe he did this. But then he solidified, his support, particularly through Proposal A, when he ended the 25-year property tax revolt and said schools should be financed with a smaller property tax and an increase in the sales tax. And that came, and he had blowout wins in 1904 and 1998. And in 1998, when the smoke cleared on the day after the election, for the first time in 40 years, Republicans dominated all three branches of state government. That obviously wouldn't have happened, if Jim Blanchard would have won in 1990. Whether for good or for bad, I'm not smart enough to say.
I do think the Supreme Court, he would have, if he'd been elected, a lot of those changes he made were at the end of his term when he managed to maneuver, justices onto the court of, people onto the Court of Appeals and then fill in openings. So it might have been that Blanchard might have had a couple of appointments of younger people who would have stayed on, and so that might have changed
Or some who
things.
might have stepped down so that he could make appointments for younger people. Yeah, that might have.
Right.
Might have
So we might have seen a little different court, but he really had that down to a science as far as getting people on the court that he wanted.
Charlie, as a political reporter, how do you resist the call of the horse race, the pull to report about who's ahead, who's behind?
Well, you can't resist that. I mean, as much as we all say, well, this year we're not going to do the horse race, it enters into it. People want to know where does it stand. I mean, it's a political polling is a fact of life, and I don't think we're going to get away from it. But I think, I don't think that you gear your coverage. You have to, okay, here's the debate story, you let both camps have their say on it, and then you don't write from then on saying, the lead desperately trailing in the polls, candidate X today announced, or, you kind of leave the poll there, you left that snapshot in time, and that's all it is a snapshot in time. You're not predicting what's going to happen on election day. But political polling, it's never going to go away.
Kathy, does the same hold true for the Associated Press?
Yeah, I mean, you have to report on the polls because, like you said, people do want to know where they are. I just try to put them in context, It's like, well, her numbers seem to have gone up because of the performance in the last debate. Or, looking at the poll, people are beginning to be a little bit more optimistic about the economy moving forward. And so I don't look just at the horse race numbers. I try to look at what else the poll is telling you and who's shifting. I mean, is it, women shifting this way, young people, old people? I try to go through the poll as thoroughly as possible without just picking out little parts, because you have to watch that too. I mean, once you get to small little groups of people. You don't want to be sitting there reporting that this percentage of people are going that way because your poll sample is too small, and that's not legitimate. But I do try to put things in context, write about what else is happening in the campaign. Has there been a series of ads that have done some damage or things like that? And then I'm very, very careful about how I let people interpret their own polls, because if it's not actually in the poll, we have some people that just want to interpret all sorts of things out of their own polls, and it's like, if it's not backed up by the poll, I'm not going to use it.
And Ron, do the polls have any impact at all on the editorial page or on your endorsements?
No, they don't. We don't. We don't even deal with who's a long shot. We deal with who the candidates are, and we lay out the issues for them and get their views on the issues. But I as somebody who covered a lot of political campaigns, the poll story, who's ahead, the strategy, how are you going to catch up, how are you going to make up ground, I got to tell you, that's the fun story to do. That's the story that's got sort of the hard news edge to it. It's kind of like writing sports, It's just that's an exciting story to be a part of, and I like those stories better than somebody saying, well, we need an explainer on the single business tax. Okay. I'd rather do the horse race, and I mean, there's a place for both, but the easier story to write is who's ahead, why, and what's going to happen next.
Well, we thank you very much, the three panelists who have joined us. It's been a terrific